have the distinct pleasure of introducing our very first speaker tonight, Ilan Stavans. Ilan is Lewis Sebring Professor of Humanities and Latin Culture and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless Books, the host of the NPR podcast In Contrast, and the author of the new book, What is American Literature? In his own words, Ilan says about storytelling, narrative is narrative. It needs to entertain, to illustrate, to enlighten. We live by and through narratives because we have an insatiable desire to comprehend our circumstances, to share its basic tenets with others, and to appreciate how others tell their tales. Ladies and gentlemen, Ilan Stavans.
Thank you, Annabelle. The story that I'm about to tell you took place a year before the pandemic swept us away. It was still a time when we all thought that the world was free, that there was a clear distinction between good and evil, and that we knew who we were. You would think that given the amount of travel that I have done, the fact that I almost automatically accept invitations from far and wide just because I love to be in other places, to meet other people, to engage with other cultures, that I am a lover of airplanes and of flying. But the truth is that every time I take off or land, I find myself being non-religious, praying that this incredibly large machine will ascend into the sky, that the miracle will yet again take place, and that it will be suspended on that sky as the world rotates, as we accelerate and finally land somewhere else where I have been dreaming to be. I am not a fan of the actual transit between one place and another, but I am a fan of the arrival and the encounter. And just as I land, I always again find myself saying a prayer, as if God would be next to me, allowing me to make sure that routine is routine and that things will always go the same way. It was a relatively warm winter afternoon in January 2019. I had promised that I would go and give a couple of lectures and meet a variety of students in different classes in Beijing. And I was at the Newark Airport in New York City. Somehow, probably as it always does, I had the impression that this flight was going to be not quite ordinary. There were many, many hours ahead of me. I had books, I had a notebook, and I had a frame of mind that would enable me to forget that I was on a plane together with almost 400 other people, to eat that plastic food that would be served to me, to go back and forth to the bathroom, and then try to sleep, open the book again, lose patience, try to put my feet on. And before I knew it, I would be in China. I had managed to convince the host to give me a relatively comfortable seat, but I don't travel in first class because I like meddling and mixing with other people. So I had enough room for my legs to be put up and wasn't far from the bathroom. The plane took off at a relatively normal time, and I looked around. There were all sorts of people who I thought I would never see again. Particularly as we were boarding, I made friends of a couple of Brazilians who were joking about the idea of visiting China for the first time. And I, cosmopolitan as I pretended to be, recommended a few restaurants here and there, a few sights to see, and the idea that we, as Latin Americans, I am born and raised in Mexico, and China for me is just about the opposite of the culture that I grew up in, that they would find those places amenable and exciting. Maybe 6 or 7 hours into the flight, we get the pilot announcing that we are crossing over or about to the North Pole, and that unfortunately there is a medical emergency. There is a patient who is suffering, and more information will be given to us. You could hear the entire population of the airplane feeling tense, not knowing exactly what would happen, but hoping that because of the tenor, because of the way that the pilot had presented this, the passenger would improve and we would simply make it to the other side, the North Pole. What would happen to any of us if the plane crashed? If the plane had to make an emergency landing? Would there be an ambulance for this passenger? Who was this passenger? You could see all of us looking around to make sure that it was not next to us. Maybe a half hour later, another message from the pilot saying that unfortunately the passenger was in grave condition and that we would be turning back to Newark. This was 8 or 9 hours altogether from when we departed, and the fury, the anger in me was enormous, but it wasn't only me. And I could think to myself, why did I say yes to this invitation? Did I really have to go that far? Couldn't there be some sort of screen where I could simply turn it on and I would be in Beijing in front of everybody, meeting the students, the side of my thumb, and then disappearing? Turning around 8 hours back to New York. About 20 minutes later, a third message from the pilot saying that this was actually a far more extreme situation and that we would have to make an emergency landing in the nearest platform, in the nearest airport, that they were looking for an airport for this to happen. The next message announced that there was an abandoned military base in Newfoundland at the very tip, and that we would, in a few minutes, be arriving, that everybody should hold tight because it was incredibly cold outside. Oh, I could feel a sense of desperation. I couldn't put my eyes on anything, and the gentleman next to me, very polite from the very beginning, kept on texting someone on the other end that the plane was turning around, that now we were landing, and that we didn't know what would happen. We landed in this no man's land, in a place that looked like the Russian tundra. I would look out the window. It was supposedly in New York, 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, it was bright, sunny, but it looked incredibly cold. Everything was absolutely white. Soon, within 20, 30 minutes, people started getting impatient. You could hear some passengers screaming at the flight attendants that they were not sure there was going to be enough electricity, that the heater would not last. Was there enough food for all of us to eat? There was not enough toilet paper. You could see people standing up, even though the pilot had told everybody to sit quiet because some sort of helicopter or a small plane was going to come to rescue that passenger. And all of us thought, who is in danger here? Is it only that passenger? Is it all of us? What are we doing in this Boeing 777? Is United Airlines really aware of our situation? Soon, we saw a car that came. There were a number of emergency workers that entered through the door that wasn't very far from me, maybe just a few feet. They moved through the front cabin. Everybody was quiet. They took out the passenger that was in an emergency situation, and then they tried to close the door. And they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and that door would not close. And I could hear the co-pilot having come and say that the temperature outside was close to minus 60 degrees, and that door could not really be sealed again, that maybe we wouldn't be able to take off. From there on, the entire imagery of the trip is nebulous in my mind. The anxiety among the passengers became even more intense. The stewardesses, the flight attendants were bringing cookies, were bringing soda, but you could hear them also very anxious. There was a passenger 3 or 4 seats behind me who started screaming that his mother was gravely ill in Beijing and that he needed to make it on time, and took a telephone and started videoing everything that was happening. Soon it was clear that the telephones that were communicating us with the rest of the world were ceasing to work. I tried to send a text to my son and to my wife that were in New York City, and could get no reply. The man next to me very politely said that he had a particular type of extra battery or extra connection, and if I told him what and to whom I wanted to communicate, that he would try to send it. And I did it in a very cursory fashion. 1 hour went by, 2 hours, and the pilot told us that the door was now stopped, that there was enough fuel to keep everybody warm, maybe for 4 or 5 more hours, that New York had been advised of our situation, and that it was likely that the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, would come to rescue us with 3 or 4 planes. I stood up and walked through the aisles. They got crowded. I went to the bathroom. Every time that I did so, the bathrooms would look less and less livable. People were becoming intense with one another. There was a lady sitting not too far from me who kept on going on her knees and praying. And I would look at her and think, are her prayers going to do something? Are we going to get out of this? And being the grandchild of the survivors of the Holocaust, I would think to myself, what were the options that we had in front of us? Would at one point, if other planes came in, a number of passengers be allowed out and the others stayed in? And maybe the second wave would be ready to go out when the warm air would vanish and all of this would freeze, minus 60 degrees outside. At one point, the captain came and told us that the food was now almost all depleted, and that the Canadian government had been alerted of our situation, but that since this wasn't a tourist or commercial airport, there were no visa places to allow us in, so that we couldn't disembark, but that some airplane would be bringing us hamburgers from the closest city or town somewhere in Newfoundland. I made my way one more time to the bathroom, and I met the 2 Brazilians. And one of the Brazilians, laughing but very nervously, said to me, you know, in Brazil, when somebody has a dream about you, it's likely that you are not going to survive. And my sister had a dream about me that I died. I thought, we are all here because of the dream your sister had. And I told it to him, and he smiled. And I thought that I was in a kind of magic realist story, a kind of Borgesian story, where there's a larger dream that encapsulates us all, and that we are in this prison. Anyway, after 7 or 8 hours, we heard that a second airplane was going to leave Newark and finally make it to where we were, and that we were going to be transported in groups of 10 from one aircraft to another, and that we would have to bundle and leave everything behind us, that was the only way for us to survive. And I was thinking, for us to survive, one of the things that we don't know is how we're going to end. We can't control the moment of our demise. And I often think, what if we knew when that moment would come. And I thought to myself, is this the moment? I thought, would I want to be in the first group that goes out? Would I want to be sitting and allowing the mothers and the children? What about all those heroic stories that frequently happen in the movies? What side would I take? The hamburgers came in, and eventually some of us fell asleep, others started screaming. The pilot, one more time, told us all that he was furious with the United headquarters and that he was giving us the private email address of the director, of the head chief of the company. If we made it back to Newark, we should all write with expressing our fury of how mistreated we were. The aircraft landed maybe 12 or 13 hours after. We, one by one, just as in a Nazi movie, were taken out of the airplane, abandoning all our belongings. We had by then become friends of absolute strangers, but mostly we had become strangers to ourselves, having pushed to the limit in trying to find out if in circumstances like this, we were still morally and humanly connected with one another. I kept on thinking to myself, we are mostly surrounded by people that we don't know. And those people in the end are the ones that are going to be closest to. What do they think about me and what do I think about them? All of us successfully, very happily made it to the other aircraft. And when it took off, you couldn't believe the applauses, even though we were absolutely exhausted and we had 8 or 9 hours before us. We were thrilled that we were flying back. And I swore to myself never, ever to fly again, never to accept another invitation to a place, imagining that I could be in other places thanks to other types of technology. Just as we enter Newark, absolutely verschimmelt is the word in Yiddish, with a 5 o'clock shadow, starving, we were allowed to go through a special aisle through immigration. And the 2 Brazilians were next to me. And I was talking to them very happily. I was hugging them and they were hugging me. And the one that told me that in Brazil, if somebody in your family dreams that you're going to die, it is because it is an announcement. He laughed and said, you know, it's actually a joke that we Brazilians tell each other. If somebody in Brazil dreams that you're going to die, that means you're going to survive and everybody around you. And I couldn't believe it. I was thrilled and happy, but I almost pushed him because he had waited for that information until the very end. About a day later, I was back on the air going to China to deliver my lectures and meeting the students. Thank you.